I'm Paul Kirtley. I founded Frontier Bushcraft about 4 years ago. Prior to that, I worked with Ray Mears. I was course director of his outdoor education business. Worked with him in total for about 7 years, latterly full-time 5 years. I was a student of his, I guess, for about 10 if you include the time that I worked with him. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my backstory as well, because it's relevant to what I'm talking about today. But I'm a little bit frustrated with bushcraft at the moment. I'd like to see people using it more rather than just learning it, and that's really what my presentation is about. And I want to give you some examples of how I use bushcraft in my outdoor life, both in terms of what I do for work, but also what I do in my spare time, in my leisure time, if you like, and give you some ideas. I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, well, I can't do expeditions because they're expensive. I can't go anywhere because I can't get access to land." And other people are a little bit frustrated. You know, they're learning these skills, but they're kind of disconnected from the actual application. So what I really want to do today is kind of give a bit of idea and a bit of inspiration about how you might go about using these things. And let's see if the clicker works. Next bit of technology. Good. So here's a typical scene from a typical bushcraft course. There's one of my colleagues there, James. Can you all see that? Let's move that around. I don't need to see that. There's my colleague James, and he's under a parachute. And you know, the parachute has kind of become one of the cliches of bushcraft courses. Everybody has to have a parachute. Everybody, even if they're doing some sort of bushcraft camp, you've got to, you know, it's a tarp or a parachute. It's become one of those things. But it's a very static situation. And the way I came to bushcraft was not through a desire to be static. It was through a desire to travel and through a desire to make journeys. And I wanted bushcraft skills, and actually I looked for survival skills initially. I wanted those skills to augment and act as a backup during the journeys that I was making, specifically a lot of hiking journeys, solo hiking trips, both in Scotland and further afield in Pyrenees and places like that. So I came to it from the perspective of, I want to learn, what do I do if my stove fails? What do I do if I get stuck somewhere? What do I do if I break my compass? What do I do if I don't have enough food? How can I augment what I'm doing? And that's really where I came, but it was in the context of making the journey. And I became involved in teaching bushcraft eventually. And a lot of courses are very static. It's worthwhile having an outdoor classroom. It's valuable, and I think that's where the disconnect is. The parachute-based course, it's an outdoor classroom. You don't need to be doing that, though, if you just want to go out and apply the skills, and yet many people do. Now, this is, again, another typical scene from a course. People are sitting around learning carving techniques, and they're able to be supervised, and it's all safe, and it's all great, and if it rains, it's dry, that's fantastic. But, again, it's very static, and, you know, there it is. That's very, very typical scene I'm sure you're all familiar with. And here's another cliche, you know, it's all about the sharp things. Yeah, knife, you know, we're all kind of, you know, oh, shiny things, we want them. Yeah, we want them, and that's great, but they're just tools at the end of the day. I remember I went to teach a private course, and I was using the Woodlaw instructor's knife that Mears had given me, and I was batoning something quite roughly with it, and there was a knife guy who was a knife collector there who was wincing. You know, and I'm like, I don't care, it's a tool. Yeah, it's not going to break. And that's the point. People get a little bit you know, people start because they can't necessarily always be doing bushcraft. You know, people sit on their computers at lunchtime and they order another knife and they order some more shiny kit, and that's the kind of way that they become involved in the subject and they keep in touch with it. But it's frankly missing the point. I've spent time with indigenous peoples around the world, and they have, some of them have knives that you'd be embarrassed, you know, nobody at this show would walk around with a knife like some of the knives I've seen. Indigenous people, hunter-gatherers who live off the land, and yet they're able to live off the land with their skills and their knowledge, and therefore you don't need a shiny 400, 500 pound knife. It's nice to have. It's nice to have a Mont Blanc pen. It's nice to have an expensive car if you're into that sort of thing. You know, Lofty's got his Jag. It's nice to they're nice things to have, but they're not necessary. You don't need a Jag to get around. You can do with a Bic biro, you can get by with a Mora knife. The important thing are the skills and the knowledge. This term has become more and more used over recent years. Being a bushcrafter, I don't really know what that means. Maybe somebody can explain afterwards what it actually means. I kind of understand what bushcraft is, but even that's quite hard to define. I really enjoyed Lisa Fenton's talk yesterday, looking at the influences and how we come to use the term bushcraft. But now people are starting to use the word bushcrafter. I don't describe myself as a bushcrafter. I describe myself as somebody who likes spending a lot of time outdoors, who happens to have some bushcraft skills. Yeah, but they're skills, they're a toolbox that I use along the way. And also, the other phrase that gets used a lot is bushcrafting. Again, I don't really know what that means. I understand what it means to go and practice your skills. Going on a camp, practice your skills. I understand going on a course. But I don't really know what, turning it into a verb, I don't quite understand. But that's my approach to the subject. And the point here is that we're also, as a community of people who are interested in bushcraft skills, in sort of terming it as bushcrafting and being a bushcrafter, we're kind of defining it as something other, something kind of different, something separate from other things in outdoor life. And I don't see it that way. And I think in the long term that will be to our detriment, because we're kind of seen as the weirdos who wear green, who go and sit in the woods and carve spoons. Frankly, that's the way a lot of people see people who are interested in bushcraft. Your typical TGO reader or trail reader has a hard time understanding why we need a knife and a camouflage poncho and a hammock. I mean, that's frankly the way it is. And I think we kind of owe it to ourselves as people who are interested in bushcraft to kind of integrate a little bit more and prove to people we're not kind of weirdos that wear green. We do wear green, and maybe some of us are a little bit strange, but that's fine. Diversity is good. But it's kind of seen, we're kind of defining it as something other, whereas I think we can integrate it much more and actually get a lot more out of the subject ourselves and help other people who are maybe still in the brightly coloured plastic cagoules and tents, maybe just to experience the outdoors in a slightly more direct way, in the way that we do. Okay, and this is the kind of thing that I really, I like to get away from the parachute, both personally and on courses. What I like about the skill set is it allows you to access places in a minimalist way, in a way that respects nature, and you can get out and enjoy the best of it. Yeah. Here's an amusing picture. This is actually me, believe it or not, many years ago. And as I say, I started in the outdoors. I was a mountain biker and I was a hiker. This is me walking the West Highland Way back in 1993, I think that was. Ben Nevis in the background. But I came at the subject from a perspective of, I want to make journeys and I want a skill set to go along with that. I've always been interested in nature. I've always been interested in trees and plants. I've always been interested in animals. And to me, at the heart of the subject is a knowledge of animals, a knowledge of plants, a knowledge of how to use them, knowledge of how they behave, whether it's via tracking, whether it's via botany. Those things are at the core. It's not about the kit. It's about the knowledge and it's about the skills. I spent a lot of time doing things in the UK. I've done my fair share of wearing kind of red and orange Gore-Tex jackets and going up mountains and that type of thing. And here's a trip that we did recently in Sweden last year. And I like to get out and move through the country and see things and experience it rather than just sitting in one spot. It doesn't always snow when I'm doing a trip. Yeah. And here's me trying to look happy. That was a pretty cold and damp day. But what I'm trying to get at here is, as you start to go other places, you start to experience other conditions outside of your normal comfort zone. If you just go into the same woods all the time and camping with your same kit, you get comfortable. You get comfortable. So I'd encourage you to go out and make journeys and use your skills, simply because it will make your skills better. It will make you better. It will enhance your abilities to look after yourselves. So going to cold, wet places really improves your ability to manage your clothing, understand the risks of hypothermia, which personally I can then bring back to a course and help people understand that before they go out. Yeah, I still like making journeys. This is a kind of selfie that I took on a solo journey that I did in Scotland last year. And I like making journeys. That's what I like doing. I still do it. I'm an instructor who actually goes out and does stuff. And I wish I could spend less time marketing and on Facebook and all that kind of jazz that you need to do these days, and more time doing this sort of thing. But you know, it's a balance. But the important thing for all of us is that you go out and you do things and you use the skills. You know, whether it's understanding water purification, can you drink that? Is it clean? What do I need to do to it to make it safe? I'm up above the tree line, I'm in the hills, how do I look after myself? All those sorts of things. And in going to new places, you see things that you don't normally see. You find plants and trees that are not in the woods that you normally go to around where you live. So I spend a lot of my time in the south of England teaching skills on courses. I'm not from that area originally, I'm from the northeast of England originally. My accent's kind of gone now. So this, up in Scotland, you get lots of this, which is bird cherry, juniper, wall of 3 needles, I do know the answer. And, you know, very, very good for tinder, lots of uses. But you're not going to find it everywhere. So going outside of your normal zone, you're going to find things that you don't otherwise find. So to me, that's already a way of integrating journeys with your bushcraft, and also your bushcraft journey of learning in itself. That if you just sit in one place, you're going to learn less. If you travel more, you're going to learn more. And it doesn't have to be far. This is only Scotland talking about. Okay, and I try and bring that back to some of the courses that we run. Here's a scene from one of our courses. Setting up, guys are just sort of getting a tarp set up there. They've just learnt the tarp knots a few days before, and they're just setting up. But we're taking them out, away from the parachute, into the woods, and using the skills in the way that they're designed to be used. Setting up a light camp very quickly at the end of a day. And here's some guys. I actually saw one of those gentlemen around. I don't know if he's in the audience. No, I saw him the other day. And here again, you know, lightweight camp, and they're using their skills. They've split the wood out. They're using the feather sticks. They're actually applying the skills as part of the training, not just sat around a parachute, because that's the way that they'll be used in reality. Okay. So as I say, I like to get out and do journeys. And a lot of people think that going on overseas trips is expensive, and I think that's partly the bushcraft industry's fault, you know, because we market things that are, for some people, a bit expensive. But that's because you're paying us to be there to look after you, and you're paying us to arrange things for you. Yeah? So you're exchanging your time, you know, it's more convenient for money. You can do a lot of trips on your own, but you might need a bit more time to research it. You might need to ask people for contacts. You might need a bit more time for the travel. But you can go on trips. I was talking to a few guys the other day, and you can actually get to Scandinavia, for example, pretty cheaply. You can get cheap flights to Sweden or Norway, and then you can hire kit there if you need to, or take your own kit. And that in itself is good discipline, because you're not then taking the Dutch oven and the axe and, you know, all the stuff out of your boot for 500 yards to the campsite. You're actually having to put it in a rucksack or a hold-all and take it on a plane where you've got weight restrictions and you've got to carry it with you. So just that fact in itself is good discipline. It doesn't cost a lot of money to get to Northern Europe or Scandinavia. Here we are in northern Sweden in the autumn. Lots of great stuff there, you know, foraging, you know, blaeberries, fantastic scenery. You can fish, you can have fires, lots of interesting wildlife tracking opportunities. Got some droppings of elk there, or moose as the North Americans would call them. Fantastic spots to camp, and you're never quite sure what you're going to wake up to. It does often snow on trips that I do. I often have to do trips in the winter because I'm teaching a lot in the summer, which is why it snows a lot on my trips. Okay, but nothing a tarp and a fire won't resolve. So again, we're using the skills for real here. That was a cold, damp morning, and we've got a tarp up and we've got a fire going. We've got that recirculation of warm air. We can light the fire easily because we've got the skills. We know which resources to use, and we're comfortable. Everybody's happy. Yeah, and you know, it's a great hiking trip. It was hunting season. That's why we've got the orange on there. And some of those Scottish mountain skills came in handy there as we went over this range of hills. A couple of the frontier guys there with me as well. But we're getting out and doing stuff. And okay, some of it is not really to do with what we might call bushcraft. It's more to do with what we might call hill walking. But a lot of it is to do with bushcraft, what we would define as bushcraft. And maybe we just need to widen our view of what bushcraft is. Now back to courses. also, I am very keen on the kind of side that takes us away from dependence on equipment. And some of our courses are very much about stripping away your dependence upon sleeping kit, on firelighting kit, on navigational kit, so that you're taking more from nature and natural resources and less reliance upon the equipment that you have with you. And you know, all of these things, you can have a very sort of intensive experience and learn a lot of these skills, but maybe you just use one of them. Maybe the next time you do a canoe trip, this style of pot hanger is very, very useful to you, or just withying it up and binding it with some bark. Maybe that in certain circumstances is useful. You're not going to use all the skills all the time, but you can use them in other parts of your outdoor life. You know, and in learning more advanced firelighting techniques as well, again, you're not necessarily going to use these very often, but it makes all of your firelighting better, so that when you do make a journey and you've paddled in a canoe all day and it's raining and muddy and you're tired at the end of the day, okay, you're not necessarily lighting fire by hand drill, but because you can light fire with a really small ember, you've got no trouble at lighting your fire at the end of the day. Your fire skills are much, much better. So there's a real value in the bushcraft skills that you learn back home, taking them on a journey. They're going to keep you safe. And attention to detail and doing things well is something that transposes really well across onto expeditions as well. So when you start ending up in places like this in Canada, you've got a sort of self-discipline, you've got an awareness and ability to make things tidy, you've got a place for everything, everything in its place. And that, to me, is where a lot of the skills that we can practice close to home then lend over to what we do further afield. Because once you get into a wilderness, those of you that were present at Ray Goodwin's talk yesterday, he talked about the difference between doing things close to home and the difference between doing things in the wilderness. The severity of things going wrong when you're further away is more significant. I was talking to Sarita Robinson yesterday as well, and we were talking about, you know, every day, you know, we might lose our phone or mislay our phone, we might mislay our keys, we might leave something at home and have to go back for it. But then going on to Ray's talk later on, he was talking about a paranoia check in camp to make sure absolutely you have all the kit before you leave, because once you're going off down that river and you've gone down several sets of rapids, you're not going back to the campsite. So the consequences are higher. So developing that discipline at home is a very, very useful thing. Here's another scene from our French river trip. And again, you know, we're not using birch bark canoes. You know, we've got helmets on. Some of our portage packs are modern waterproof portage packs. You know, this is modern outdoor life. Yeah, we're not trying to recreate some sort of romantic ideal of the past, but we are experiencing that environment in a very real way. If we do things wrong there are consequences. And all the skills that we learn at home, particularly in terms of firelighting and navigation and self-management in terms of clothing, all of them are directly applicable to these. And you actually get much better at them by applying them as part of a journey. We tend to spend too long doing things when we have the time. In management, there's something called Parkinson's law, which is the work tends to expand and take up the amount of time available that you make available to it. And it's exactly the same with bushcraft skills. If you give yourself 3 hours to do something, it'll take 3 hours. If you're forced at the end of the day to be quick with your cooking because you've got to cook your dinner, you've got to cook bread for the next day, you've got to get your camp sorted, you've got to get your head down because you're tired and you need some rest, and then you've got to get up and be efficient with your breakfast, get the coffee on, make some pancakes, clean up, leave no trace, pack everything in the boats and off, it makes you much, much better and efficient. You force yourself to be more efficient. And also, those of you that are paddlers, we practice a lot of skills. I see a lot of parallels between canoeing in the UK and bushcraft in the UK. We spend a lot of time practicing skills and getting very good at particular techniques, but we don't really have anywhere to go and use them to their full capacity. And it's the same with the paddling stuff. You know, here we're going back upriver, and while you might practice these techniques in Wales with Ray Goodwin, it's Ray Goodwin there and one of the clients there, you might practice these techniques in Wales if you went to do a course with him, but here you're using them for real. You have to use them to get back up the river. And here we are with another guy, and he's moving rapidly to bring this boat up through this side channel here. And that day we went up multiple sets of rapids in it was wet like today, and the rocks were slippery, we had to be careful, but it's easier than taking everything out of the boat and portaging. But the only real chance you get to use these things is going a little bit further afield, because river access in the UK is awful, and particularly access to the bank. Okay, traditional kit, that's an interesting one. I was having a discussion with Kevin Callan a while ago. Those of you that know Kevin, he's written a lot of guidebooks to certain canoeing areas in Canada. And we were talking about how now you go into a Canadian, I think we've all got this romantic idea in the UK that if you go into a Canadian outdoor store, you've got all this fantastic oldie-worldy gear. It's really, really hard to find these days. It's all plastic. And so some of it's much cheaper and nastier than stuff you'll find in the UK. And we had quite a good discussion about it. And the conclusion we came to was that it's down to the length of trips that people take. You know, back in the day when people were out in canoes for a month or 2 months, canvas pack makes sense. Yeah, it's hard wearing. Yeah. Whereas if you're only going out for a weekend or a week, you can buy something cheaper and plastic that will do. So you know, a lot of modern equipment is there because it's cheaper to produce, it's cheaper to buy, and we're not really pushing it. But as soon as you start going on longer journeys, the traditional kit makes sense. And a lot of us are drawn to traditional kit. That's part of the kind of bushcraft ethos, but I think it's important to understand what the benefits are. You know, we often have discussions about should we, you know, are Moras good enough, or should we have a full tang knife? And you know, there's equal debates to have about do we take a more expensive canvas bag and put a dry bag inside it, or do we just buy a modern portage sack? And it's the same sort of argument. It's about what can you rely on in the wilds? What can you know, if you've got no opportunity to replace it, what can you rely on? And I think when you choose your kit, think about that, because if you're going to go and make journeys, make sure it's not going to fail you. And going to Canada, fantastic colours, particularly in the autumn, but also in the summer, the woods are wonderful. But you could walk into those woods and not find your way out. These are the backwoods on a little river trip that I did on my own, and I took this picture because it really made me think that there's a lot of people who would have trouble navigating through that and would be worried once they got into that. And you'd be right to worry, because you know, we're used to small blocks of woodland. As soon as you start going to wilder places, you need to improve your navigation skills. You need to think about, how do I find my way back? A lot of these things we're not forced to do in the UK, particularly when we're in the woods. We're forced to do them a bit more in the hills. This is a little river system. Fantastic, loads of familiar species up there, and some very unfamiliar species as well, because it's a different environment. And going back to what I was saying before, you know, you come across things that are very, very familiar, and then you come across things that are completely unfamiliar. And that's one of the things I like about making journeys, particularly further afield, because you expand your knowledge, you push yourself out of your comfort zone, and you find more out about the world. There's always more to learn. Yeah, and that's what keeps me going with this subject that we call bushcraft. There's always more to learn. So this is called bunchberry. This is a friend of mine here, Norm Doquis, and he lives up on the Doquis Native Reserve up at the top of the French River. And here he is with a bunch of school kids from the local area. They've come in by bus, and he's doing a nature trail with them. And he's educating. Some of them are native kids, some of them are white kids, and but he's educating them all about the environment. And he's a very knowledgeable guy. He works for the Department of Natural Resources in Canada. And the first time I went to meet him, this is one of his cabins on the reserve. This isn't the main village. It's out on the reserve, and he's got a few cabins. And this is one of his places, and it's a fantastic place to go. The only way you can get there is by boat. There is a little ATV trail through the woods, but the easiest way is to get there by boat. This is his camp, which we visit on our French River trip. I'm not trying to sell the French River trip. The point is that it's just a wonderful place, and you can see the side. I mean, the scale of this place. This is a side bay off the French River, and there's nobody else there. It's not like I haven't done a sort of Bear Grylls sort of filming photo here, and you know, there's a sort of resort here. I know how TV works. Don't worry, it's fine. The point is, there's nothing else around. He's built this himself. It's sort of chainsaw and nails, basically, and some old doors and windows. And he's got some decking there. And it's a great place to go and visit for a couple of days, because then we go into the backwoods and we learn a lot about what's there. Because the point of me showing you this picture really is that you can see here, all around, it looks like it's largely coniferous. But that's because they're the hardiest trees. They're on the edge where they're most exposed, the edge of the woods, and also it's the coldest spot. Cold air drops, warm air rises. So where the water is, that's also in the lowest points, that's also going to be the coldest place, particularly in the winter, so you get the hardiest trees there. Once you go into the backwoods, it's more like that picture that I showed you earlier, where you've got this lovely green lush forest in the summer. It's more broadleaf, deciduous stuff, and there's lots of interesting stuff back in the woods. First time I met Norm, I was invited up to a gathering, a party at the camp, and this kind of starts moving away from maybe what you kind of perceive as your kind of typical sort of bushcraft scenario. But I learned a lot at this camp. I learned a lot. There were a lot of native people there. I learned a lot from them, just in terms of how they did things. We went out into the woods and gathered certain resources, but also we had a fun time. So they're just using their bushcraft as part of, they're out, they're in, shorts, and they're having beers, but they're a long way out from any civilization here, or any urban situation. But they're just having a relaxed time. They've got cheap tents, but they're using their skills and knowledge of the forest to bring things in, whether it's for making tripods or getting food. They're using it. And we went for a bit of a walk with Norm, and he's very, very knowledgeable about the trees and plants. And so here he is showing us a few things. This Indian cucumber root, which is quite easy to recognize, pretty tasty, crunchy, and does taste like cucumber. That's the leaf there. Okay, he used to work as a fishing guide on the river. He's very, very good with his fishing, and also, again, what I love about this is he's got an old piece of cardboard. They're just using what they've got, and I like that. We get very, very anal about we've got to have the right piece of kit, we've got to have the right thing, the right stuff in our camp. He's got an old filleting knife and a piece of cardboard. The important thing is he can catch the fish. That's the important thing. Yeah, he knows how to catch the fish. And when you travel further afield, bushcraft, the skills in the woods mean different things to different people. You get many more people using firearms around the world, and again, it's an integral part. They go out and shoot ducks, they go out and shoot geese. In the winter, they go out and hunt the white-tailed deer that come through the area. But you don't need to go to Canada to have a good canoeing experience. This is in Scotland again, canoeing the River Spey. You can come with me and Mr. Goodwin, but you can do it on your own as well. You don't have to pay for somebody to take you. You just need to spend a bit more time with the skills and planning, and you can do these things yourself. And this is in our own country, or maybe not for not much longer. Hey, Steve. And again, very similar scenes. Tripods, cooking over the fire. Fantastic experience, and for not a huge amount of money. Maybe a bit more time and training than going for a hike in Scotland, but you can still do this. And there's some very happy people on the trip. And the really nice thing about the Spey is it's very varied. So you get tastes of different environments as you go down. Excuse me. And right at the end, it kind of goes out into this outwash plain that's really quite unique, and you don't really see much outside of North America. And here we are just on one of the pebble bars, last lunch on the last day of the trip. There's some quite happy people there, which is always good. But it's a great trip, and I'd encourage you to do it, whether it's with us or not. Just get out there and do these things, because it's there. It's all there. Okay, here we are in Norway. This is a trip I did in March. We had a training phase. My friends had done some skiing before, but not much and not recently. One had done more alpine skiing and no real cross-country. One had done cross-country when he was a kid and a little bit of alpine recently, but neither had done much mountain touring style skiing. So we stayed in a little village, and we went up to local ski areas for a few days, and we had brilliant weather, and we had fires, and we cooked sausages for lunch, and great. But that's very, very typical for Norway. You'll see Norwegian families doing this on a Sunday afternoon, going out on skis, stopping, quick fire, cook some sausages. It's just part of their outdoor life. It's just part of what they do. They don't kind of term it as something other. Going back to my original point about going bushcrafting, it's just they're going out for a ski, and they light fire and they cook over it. It's just normal. And then we headed up into the hills and things got a bit worse. We had a very wet, windy, warm winter here in the UK. In Norway, it was damp snow. It wasn't really cold snow. It was warmer than normal. It was windy, and the result is looking like that. Now, there's a nice big valley that looks something like the Yorkshire Dales over there, but you can't see it. It's got all this scrubby birch. It was blowing a gale, very unpleasant. Here we are, setting off from one of the huts we're staying in one morning. Blowing a gale through there, very, very low visibility. Your nav needs to be good. Your skills in terms of looking after yourself in the cold needs to be good. It improves your discipline. You know, coming here, it's a piece of cake. You know, a few wet days in the woods. After that, it's nothing. So you're increasing your comfort zone as well by doing these things. Those of you that came to my axe talk this morning, I talked about, and yesterday and the day before, I mentioned dodgy axes that you find in woodsheds. Here's a very good example. This is very typical for woodsheds in cabins. Really, really abused. You can see here where it's been battered, the helve is damaged, the head's coming off, the wedge is rotting away. It's horrible. So again, not understanding what makes your tools safe and what makes them unsafe, and the circumstances under which you can and can't use them. Very useful on a trip. You know, we're out in the middle of nowhere in a cabin. You go into the woodshed. You've got a range of different axes. Some of them are okay to use. Some of them I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. So again, the more experience you have of using the axes at home, the better. And you can also see this has been hit. You can see how this is folded over at the top. That's because somebody's been hitting it with another axe, and that is not tempered to be hit with metal, and it's basically folding it over the top, which again is probably why this is loose, because it's probably distorted the eye slightly, and it's bent. Okay, being out in the snow, as I said, there was a lot of snow this winter. We did a bit of snow holing. So again, it's not your typical kind of bushcraft skill in terms of what we do in the UK, but it's a really, really important outdoor survival skill. There's Henry digging down. Henry is about 5'10", so you can see that's about 6 foot deep already, that hole, and he's still going. A bit later on, that far down, we used a wood saw as well that we had to saw out blocks, but we made a really, really good shelter. And that night, it was a horrible blizzard, blowing a gale, and we were fine in there. So it was a really, really good experience. And again, extending your outdoor experience, extending your knowledge. We had some problems as well, and that's the other thing about journeys. You have to solve problems. You're too far away from help to get something else. It's not something that you need to call search and rescue to get you out. You know, here we have, I'll give you a different picture. Henry's boot sole came away. Now these ski bindings, they clip in here, and he basically had a little slip over backwards, and I'd never seen it happen before, but it ripped the sole off his boot. So here we are. Luckily, when it happened, we were only 2 kilometres away from the hut we were heading to. We'd done like about 25 kilometres that day. Just coming down into the valley, we'd stopped just to assess the route through all this scrubby birch. He slipped over, ripped that. So we had 2K to do with him not on skis to the cabin, and then we had to come up with a fix. I haven't got a picture of the fix there, but it basically involves zip ties and electrical tape and other bits and pieces that we had with us. And then we had 5K to ski out to the road the next day, because this was the last night. So again, we were lucky that we weren't right out in the middle of nowhere, but it held fast, and he was able to ski plenty good the next day. So, you know, it's good having those things. And one of the things we saw that day, on the last day, there's a family. There were three elk coming up the valley, and the wind was blowing towards us. They couldn't smell us, and we spent about 10 minutes watching them as they came up the valley, feeding on the birch on the other side. So really, really good experiences as well in terms of nature when you get out away from your normal areas. Bit of winter camping. Some of you have been up to our stand, will have seen our snow trekker tent up there. This is it used in its proper environment. It doesn't really like being in wet, muddy fields. It's a canvas tent. It's not designed to really be used in these conditions. This is the sort of situation it's designed to be used in. Cold, dry, snowy conditions, but the stove is really, really valuable. Being able to get the moisture out of your clothing at the end of the day, really, really useful. And being able to produce that firewood, you're then really relying on your bushcraft skills, your ability to use an axe, particularly. Really, really fantastic environment to journey through. Cold, people worry about the cold temperatures. I actually prefer it when it's sort of -20, -30 to when it's just below 0 because it's dry. It's easier to look after yourself in a way. You have to be very careful with your hands. You have to think ahead more, but in terms of moisture, it's much better, and it extends your, again, it extends your comfort zone. Yeah, axe skills are very important there. You can see we felled a couple of trees there. That's the Scandi axe I was using this morning for those of you that were there. And when you're camping out, winter camping, you've then got the opportunity, if you've got the time, to go and extend your bushcraft skills. You know, so what we did on this particular trip is we had a fairly static camp. We moved a few times, but we had a fairly static camp. We were there for a couple of weeks. And that then allowed us, as a little base, a little toe hold in the forest. We were quite a way out in the forest, a little boat hole that we can then, we've got a little safety net. If anybody has a problem, we've got a warm space that we can go back to, albeit just a canvas tent, but then we can go out and then we can actually extend our skills. The classic of the Northern Forest, of course, is the lean-to. So here's a lean-to that we built. There it is in action. There's one of my friends, Stuart, who is, the long log fire is just getting going there, and he's enjoying a bit of a sit down after working hard on that shelter. And there's Ian, who's on our stall at the moment as well, has joined for to enjoy the fire. It's a really fantastic experience. It takes some effort though, and you need to be good with an axe, particularly to get the firewood. There's sort of telegraph pole sized logs on there. And then you can also extend and do things that you can't necessarily do at home. So here's a way of getting water using a mosquito head net. It's preferable that it's untreated, so you don't want loads of nasty chemicals in there. But you basically, in the forest, you've got this powdery snow. It's not compacted, it's not wind blown, it's not wind transformed, so you can't cut blocks. And if you've got no metal container, this is a really handy way of getting water. You basically hang up a bag of snow next to the fire, the radiant heat of the fire melts it, and after, what will happen initially is the snow will melt, but it will soak in like blotting paper. It just up into the snow, but then after a while it gets a sort of critical mass of water in there, and then it starts dripping out. So you think nothing's happening for a while, and don't be tempted to put it too close to the fire. You don't want to burn the cloth, but eventually it will drip out, and you get a really good, it's like a dripping tap, drip, 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 and you can get a lot of water from that very easily. That's a good technique. You could use a scarf or a spare garment. It's a good survival technique. And you can also practice other skills. Here's a quick survival shelter that we built. Basically, base of a spruce tree, low branches coming down, snow increases on the outside over the course of the winter. You get a build-up of snow. You go in and it's a little bit like a small teepee inside. You can remove some of the dead branches low down, which is handy, particularly if you want to start a fire. You can put maybe some more branches on the outside, maybe pile up a bit more snow, and then, you know, you don't want it completely sealed, obviously, because you don't want to die of carbon monoxide poisoning, but you know, there's plenty of gaps in that. But it's a warm, relatively sheltered space that's quite quick to create. It's not something you can do very easily here, but it's something you can do, and very apt for the Northern Forest. So again, you're extending your skills and your confidence in that environment. And then also you can do things that you can't do at all nearer to home. Towards the end of a trip, we hired some snow machines. We were back to kind of a little village. We have some friends there, and we hired some snow machines from them. And it felt, as somebody who spent many years going up hills in Scotland and slogging my way up both in summer and winter, it felt very wrong to go up a mountain of a similar size on a snow machine. But it was also very fun. And yeah, the views from the top were quite fantastic. So that's something you're never going to do in Scotland, but very fun. So from one nice view to another nice view, and some people say to me, do you ever go on a normal holiday? And I have to say, no, I don't go on a normal holiday very often, whatever a normal holiday is. But I've got some friends in Spain, and they hired a sort of seafront holiday home up in Galicia, which is northwest Spain. A lot of people who live in Madrid, it gets too hot in Madrid. They leave Madrid for the summer. They don't go to the south of Spain like all the Brits who sort of fry themselves down there, down on the Costa del Sol and into Portugal on the Algarve. They go northwest where it's cooler. They get the Atlantic breezes, fantastic seafood. If you want to learn about seafood, northwestern Spain is a fantastic place to go. You find stuff there that you don't get anywhere else, and absolutely fantastic. Really fresh. Very good food up there. And it was kind of that type of normal holiday. very good local beer. Definitely was that type of holiday. It wasn't that much of a serious expedition. Brugal, very good rum for those of you that like rum. But not far away, because we're on the coast, there's loads of interesting plants. Yeah, there's lots of things that you might find in the UK, some things that are pretty common in Europe that are not so common here, or that you get at all. So you've got some sea holly. And this intrigued me. You know, this was literally, there was a boardwalk at the side of the street, and I was walking along it, and I was looking at that, and I was like, that's interesting. And you can see there's like a little seafront there. There's a little kind of restaurant cafe. There's a beach just here, and there's this little stream that's coming out, and there's loads of interesting stuff. There were some cattails and other things in there that I recognised, but I had no idea what this was. I was like, I need to get a bit closer to that. But there was a sign saying, please don't go in. It's kind of like a little nature reserve. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to respect that. But I moved around, and I got to a spot where I could actually have a closer look at the flowers, and it turns out to be something called hog fennel. I recognised it was something in the Apiaceae family, which is a carrot family. It looked similar to fennel in some ways, but it wasn't right. And I looked it up when I got home, and it's hog fennel. And it's very rare in the UK. You only find it on some parts of the Thames estuary and other spots in the UK. But there was lots of it there. So again, you know, in travelling further afield, I wasn't on an expedition. I wasn't on a bushcraft specific trip. But again, you know, I'm just keeping my eye out for things that is going to augment what I know and add to my knowledge that then can be used in other circumstances. So my view is that you've got, you know, we all should be trying to integrate these skills more into our life. Hello. We should all be trying to integrate these skills more into our life than sort of trying to define it as something other. So rather than trying to define ourselves as bushcrafters and we're going bushcrafting, we should just be saying, I'm going outdoors and I'm going to enjoy it, and I've got this bunch of skills that other people don't have, and try and get other people enthusiastic about them, because it really, for me, bushcraft has really enhanced my life in many ways, particularly tracking, but also botany. It just makes me see the world in a different light. It makes me value things more, certainly makes me value the natural world more, the resources that we have. The more you know the usefulness of things, the more you value them. And so, to me, we should be trying to encourage other people to be interested in bushcraft, not by defining it as a separate subject, but defining it as something that can be part of our daily lives, whether we're on an expedition in northern Sweden in the winter, or whether we're on a holiday in northern Spain drinking beer and rum and looking over the front and seeing what interesting plants we can see. There's always something to learn, and that's the fantastic thing that I find about what we call bushcraft. So my point really would be, is bushcraft really something other? And maybe that's why we always struggle to define it as something, because it's so integral really to our lives once we get into it. So that is the last slide, I think. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to take them right now. If you want to, yes? Yeah, we've got a microphone. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that bushcraft is quite frequently spoken of as something other. And you were talking a lot about Scandinavia and North America, but that link between other outdoor pursuits and outdoor living skills is not unique to those places. I've noticed it in places like Switzerland and Holland and Germany. Why is it then that here in the UK we seem to have to define outdoor living skills as being something other? Why do we see that there's a disconnect with the natural world in this country?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think partly because a lot of what gets put under the umbrella of bushcraft are woodcraft skills. You know, particularly, you know, Lisa mentioned, if you were here for Lisa Fenton's talk yesterday, she talks about the woodcraft movement in the States. So people like Mason and Kephart and all those guys who wrote those manuals back in the sort of early days of that movement. They had a defining effect on what we call bushcraft today, because a lot of it's woodcraft, a lot of it's forest-based skills. Okay, so when we look to those skills, we also look to more forested places. It's one of the reasons why there's a lot of bushcraft schools in Kent and Sussex as well, because they're the most forested counties in the UK, and it's why other places struggle to have bushcraft schools. I think there's a concentration of schools where there are woods, because it's kind of what's taught on those syllabuses is defined in terms of having access to woodland, and that's why I think people then, if they want to, we're not on a big island, and there's lots of people. And so when people look to go somewhere wilder that's also wooded, they start looking to Northern Europe, to Scandinavia, to North America. But I think there's a bit of reverse logic in the sense that it doesn't have to. That doesn't have to be defined. Doesn't have to define the subject here. You know, we can go out and do. You know, I talked about Scotland. You know, I started in Blair Athol, beautiful walk up through the glen, loads of trees, loads of plants, lots of wildlife, lots of things to see. Up into the hills, above the tree line, through the hills, fantastic walking. Lots of. You don't even have to go up onto the peaks, through the valleys, through the old cattle droving routes, over the Larry Grew, down to the Rothiemurcus forest, last vestige of the Caledonian pine forest that we have in the UK. Fantastic little journey to do over a number of days. And I see that as much involving bushcraft as doing a canoe trip in Canada, because all of those elements are still there. You know, you might not be making use of all of those elements all the time, but in terms of understanding the environment, it's all there. I think the problem that we have in the UK is the ability to use those resources freely. You know, we don't. You know, you can go to other places, and that's the attraction to somewhere like Canada or Sweden. We can go and use those resources where, you know, in the UK you need landowner's permission and da-da-da-da-da. It's easier in Scotland. It's not so easy in England and Wales. So I think that's part of it. I think it's because we're limited in what we can do here in some ways in terms of making journeys. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to define the subject. I think there's lots more we can do here, and I think part of the point I was making is that if you integrate it more with your daily life, then you don't have to go to these places for it to be part of your life. Whereas if you see it as something other and something that is defined by what used to happen in the good old days in Canada, in the days of the Coureur de Bois, or you know what used to happen with you know what the pioneers used to do, then you're kind of defining it in a more limited way. You know, so I think you need to sort of see it as part. You know, what can I do here? And then it's not defined by those more limited perceptions of the subject. Any other questions? One at the back there.
Yeah, hello there, yeah.
Hiya.
Very educational and very good talk indeed. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
When you go to such as Sweden, Canada and all these places, I know having gone to Scotland on many occasions myself, the holidays or the adventure can be spoilt by mosquitoes, which are horrendous.
Yes.
Other than skin so soft, how do you cope with them?
That's a good question. You can't always rely on repellents. I mean, in the worst of the insect seasons in Canada, you have to wear a bug suit. You know, you have to wear a full body suit, mosquito head net, gloves. You need, you know, real good seal around the bottom of your trousers, because you'll just get eaten alive otherwise. The repellent won't do enough to stop them getting at you. So you either go early in the season after the breakup. So after the ice melts, starts to break up, go then when it's a bit cold, so end of May, beginning of June, or go later in the year. That's why we run a lot of our trips in September in Canada, because at that point, the black flies have long gone and the mosquitoes are really dying down. Whereas if you go in June and July, it can be really horrendous. So.
What about the locals? How do they cope? Do they have any ingenious ways of dealing with it other than shutting windows and locking themselves in?
Well, yeah, I mean, you saw a picture of Norm's cabin there. It's all got mosquito netting on it, and you know, on the windows and the doors, so you can have the windows open, but they're all mozzied up. And no, you either have to grin and bear it. So when I was there, the first time I went to see Norm on the French River, it was end of July, beginning of August. It was very hot. It was about 35 degrees during the day. The insects are not out. It's too hot. You know, it's like when you go to Scotland, you know, the worst midge times are early in the morning and lasting at sort of dusk, lasting at night. So when it cools off, there's more moisture in the air. They don't like to be too dry and too hot. So during the day, it can be fine, and particularly if there's a bit of a breeze. But when they become horrendous, is just as it does in Scotland, it becomes cooler and damper in the evening. So I was doing another trip, actually that one where I went up that little tributary river, and I get no problems with insects. But I came down to an area where I was going to camp. I had a really, really nice night. I had a campfire. I cooked over the campfire. I was camping on an island. I went up to the top of the island to put my food up a tree in a bear bag. And I was hoisting it up, and it was just getting dark. I just started to need to use my head torch to see what I was doing. And I could hear this getting louder and louder and louder. And I was like, what the hell is it? And I suddenly realised it was this massive swarm of mosquitoes which were downwind of me and heading in my direction. So I rapidly finished tying this stuff off. So I had to go through this swarm of mosquitoes on the way back, and literally just dived into my tent and zipped up, and you could just hear them all out. So for the next 2 hours, just outside my tent. And then they just went away, and I didn't have any sign of them until the next morning. So it can often be certain times a day, just like it is in Scotland. So I think timing your activities, thinking ahead, having a bug suit if you need to, and just staying out of the way of them once they're horrendous. That would be my advice. Question?
Yeah, I think the something other thing is, a lot of it's down to the lack of imagination of a lot of outdoor professionals, really.
Right.
I mean, we run adventure camps for disadvantaged families, and they get the traditional stuff, the rock climbing, abseiling, zip wires, and things like that. But all the time we're incorporating the climbing trees in the woods, building shelters with forage for food, and we do all the traditional bushcraft skills. And we don't make a big deal about it. It's just part of being outside. And I think that's a failure of people who do the normal hard outdoorsy skills, really.
So in terms of this climbing, or do you mean in terms of the bushcraft?
Yeah,
both?
well, yes, both actually.
Yeah.
But I was thinking primarily of people that, like climbing instructors and outdoor instructors, seem to be almost unaware of their environment. That's changing slightly, but it's still there.
It is changing. I mean, I think, you know, for example, with the ML, I mean, I know some guys at Plaza Brennan, for example, and I know with the ML assessments now that the environmental side is a lot more important than it used to be. But still, it is very superficial in terms of, you know, when I did an ML assessment, they were like, wow, you know, just in terms of the environmental knowledge, because that's what we do all the time. And they don't have that level of knowledge because they're not using the resources. They're just kind of saying, well, this is tormental, this is soft brush, this is bog cotton, this is, you know, these are sundew, you know, So they're just pointing things out, but there's no real depth to that knowledge. And I think the thing that the bushcraft skills give you, because you're using the resources, or you're learning to use the resources, to give you that depth of knowledge as well. So I do firmly believe that we need to have them more integrated in the UK, but it's a slow process. And, you know, there's an element of kind of mickey taking as well which goes on, and I think it's incumbent upon any of us that are involved on the bushcraft side is that when we come up against that kind of prejudice, that you kind of disabuse them of it and say, well, actually, I know a lot more about this shit than you know, so shut up and let me teach you something. And I think you have to be that frank with them sometimes, because there is an arrogance there. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's absolutely a very good point. That the more we can do to encourage that integration, it's fantastic to hear that you're doing that.
Yeah, when you get kids talking quite normally about, oh yes, this is such and such, and you can eat the leaves and they're very nice.
Yes.
To adults, it's wonderful.
Absolutely, yeah, because immediately you're breaking down that barrier between them and the environment. And personally, that's what got me interested in bushcraft and survival skills originally, because I felt like I was going around in a bubble. That I didn't have that connection. And as soon as you start tasting things and using things, you make that connection with the environment. And I think that's very, very powerful, and I think it's often overlooked, even by people who teach bushcraft, because they get focused on the skills. They don't focus so much on the effect it has on people, particularly young people. So yeah, I think it's very important. Thank you. Question behind from Wild Bill Hickok there.
It's the last question. Do you have any views on
not necessarily bushcraft as such, but outdoor skills should be taught in schools as part of like a standard curriculum?
I think that would be fantastic if we could do that. I think there's a lot of issues with that, particularly with, you know, urban schools, if you like. But I mean, I did some courses for a school in London last summer. They had an outdoors day and they were doing all sorts of things outdoors. And I went along and I did sessions with them. It was just a bit of firelighting. We looked at a few trees and plants that they had around their school. This was in North London, Zone 2. And yeah, you can do it in that context, absolutely. I mean, you can't do what you can do out in the woods somewhere with a larger expanse, but there's a lot you can do in terms of educating kids. I think there's a lot of things that, you know, people should be taught first aid. You know, and there are other life skills that, you know, people should be taught about how to manage their finances and all those sorts of things, you know, because they're more, you know, these practical things that help us get through life. Bushcraft, I think, and survival skills are part of that, and we could do more. It's a question of time, though, I think, and also, I think on one level, forest schools is very good in that respect, but also, I think maybe having something which is a lot more integrated into the sort of classroom. You know, personally, you know, there are certain subjects that I didn't find particularly interesting at school, but I find them more interesting now because I can see the connections between what I do outdoors and what could have made a dry classroom subject a lot more interesting. And there were a few exceptions to that when I was a kid. I had a science teacher called Mr. Smallwood, who was a very good teacher, and we had a really, really nice sunny day one day, and he was like, put your notebooks away. You know, we're doing some kind of chemical bonding thing or something, I can't remember, valencies or something. And he was like, right, let's go outside. Went out onto the school field. And he's like, right, I want you to count the petals on the daisies. And I'm like, what? He goes, well, I'm just going to sit here in the sun and I'm going to count the petals on the daisies, and I want you to write down how many you get on each one, and then we'll go back to the classroom. So we did that for about 45 minutes. We sat outside counting petals on daisies. And we went back in and we put it into a histogram, and it's a normal distribution. So he taught us about normal distributions, which is really dull, but in a really interesting way. And I still remember it now. I remember the lesson, I remember the day, I remember going out, whereas most of what we did in those lessons I don't remember specifically. And I think that's, but going back to this gentleman here, it takes imagination to do that. It's very easy just to kind of get stuck in a rut the way that you educate people. So I think, yeah, I would love to see more of that, but I think it'd be an uphill struggle, personally. But the more we can all do to encourage that, the better. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate your attention, and nice to see you.